you everybody for coming. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Eric Sandeen, who's the director of WIHR, the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, and then I'll come back and tell you about the rest of these lovely people sitting up here.
Hi, I am the aforementioned Eric Sandeen. I'm the director of WIHR. And I have two announcements, or two things to say, actually. The first is that this is a kind of milestone because as of about a week ago, we actually have a budget for next year. And thanks to President Nichols, we have the assurance that there will be a budget for years following. So now we can actually plan and participate in the university planning process. So I feel this is a real milestone for the organization. The other thing I wanted to say is that when I first thought about a Humanities Institute, and this was several years ago, along about 2008 or so, what really motivated me was the kind of conversation that many of us in this room have had, but maybe not recently. The kind of conversation that's based around ideas or things that are in process. The kind of exchange in the humanities that makes a humanities community really tick. And many of us are either teachers or students here, and so the kinds of conversations that we have are workerly conversations about numbers of students or curricula or covering courses, etc. And I thought from the beginning that one of the things that a Humanities Institute should do is go back to, at least from my point of view, what really turns our crank, which is the world of ideas and the exchange that we have from people who are equally enthused about the humanities as we are. So the Humanities Institute, while it does support faculty research, it does project the faculty out into the state and bring the state to the university, and it is beginning to think about courses that could be taught in the name of the humanities. Really at base is about forming a humanities community around ideas and then seeing what happens. And so I'm delighted to see that all of this has happened. And the idea was here that we would put together the kind of conversation in a kind of stagey way, but the kind of conversation that we all wish we could have to renew us, to resuscitate us during a semester. So here we are, and I'll hand this back over to Isa to introduce a great panel and some funky objects.
I'm just going to introduce the panel. The panelists will introduce the funky objects. So the title of our gathering here today is Objects of Inquiry, Ways of Seeing and Ways of Knowing in the Humanities. And we have assembled a nicely diverse group of scholars here for you. And I'm just going to introduce them very briefly, and they can choose whether they want to tell you more about their work in due course. First, John Dorst from the Department of American Studies, Erin Forbes from English. Dr. Jim Harris is going to be facilitating this conversation. Jim is the the Andrew W. Mellon Teaching Curator at the Ashmolean Museum of Art and Archaeology at Oxford University. Right?
That's right.
And he's a specialist in teaching with objects and in facilitating object-based discussions at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. After Jim, we have Janice Harris, no relation, who is an emerita professor from the English department. And at the very end, Nick Crane from geography. So what we'd like to do here, as Eric said, is open up a conversation following from these objects and see where things lead. So please do, if you're moved to participate in sort of Quaker style, just let us know, gesture, and we'll make sure that you get the microphone. We are recording, so that's why we're asking you to use the microphone. But if you are moved and you can't get the microphone, then go ahead and participate as you wish, and we'll try to reiterate it for the cameras. So with no more ado, Jim.
Thank you, Isa, and thank you all very much for coming. And thank you, Eric, thank you, WIHR, and thank you, Nicole, for hosting us today at the museum. It is a real pleasure to be here, partly because I came 2 years ago and I had such a lovely time that I was desperate to come back, and partly because the conversations that we began 2 years ago have been running around in my work ever since, in the sense that when I'm at the Ashmolean, I'm surrounded by a particular kind of collection, which is privileged in many ways, but which I have been part of a project to try and use in new ways. Coming here introduced me to a different kind of collection, a different kind of museum, and a university which, although it seems on the surface perhaps very different, actually shares with Oxford many characteristics which we would recognise in one another immediately. One of the things that I took away when I came here last time was about the capacity of objects to speak much more widely than I had previously really considered, and the capacity of different kinds of objects to speak much more widely than I had considered. And so coming back to this particular and peculiar group of objects that we chose this morning is a treat, because these are objects which none of us really specialise in, about which we know something, but not a vast amount. And therefore they're objects which will help us to focus on the question of what questions can an object stimulate. What directions can an object take the inquiry of a student? And what questions that the student asks of the object will be most rewarding to them? And do those things change depending on what kind of discipline your starting point is? Does a geographer ask different questions of an object from an American studies person? Does somebody in the English faculty ask different questions from somebody in art history? My own background is as an art historian. I work on medieval and Renaissance sculpture, which is notably absent from this table. Or is it? Yes, it is. No. There is actually something here which relates very directly back to my own research in a weird way, which I hadn't expected to find. And so already these objects have started me off thinking in a number of directions, and I hope they've started my colleagues off. I'm going to speak very briefly to two objects, and then I'm going to ask Jonah and Erin and Janice and Nick to speak to the objects that they've chosen, which come variously from the collections of the museum, from the things which are around the place. The resources room here, I don't know if you're familiar with, but that has been part of our discussion as well. And when we've introduced our objects briefly, we will start to discuss together how they might be useful, why they might be useful, what are the lines of inquiry which they might stimulate, and how therefore might you begin to consider them in relation to other parts of the collection and in relation to the kinds of teaching that you will do with your students. How are we doing?
Actually, before we do that, I'm taking this back for one second, if I may, because I forgot to mention, first of all, to my horror, to thank the staffs at the Art Museum and the American Heritage Center, who have done a tremendous amount to enable all of this. The objects on the table are mostly from the Art Museum, but also drawn from the American Heritage Center. So we can think a little bit about where these things come from. So now I will pass it back to you, and we can talk about them in greater depth.
And that's a very important point, because the extent to which this museum is a resource is not unique within here. The American Heritage Centre next door is also an extraordinary resource, not just for information but for objects, for things, and the way in which some kinds of objects, we sometimes don't think of objects at all. It's one of the things I think Nick will perhaps talk about. So the two things that I put on the table, and I got to choose two because I came the furthest, are these. And actually the thing on my right, your left, is a stirrup from a group of stirrups which are here in the museum. There are one or two of you here who I recognise and who I've met before, and you will be familiar with the stirrup, because the stirrup was the thing which caught my eye last time I was here and proved itself to be an immensely agile object under discussion. The quality of agility in an object is something I prize very highly, and something which I believe every object possesses. That is to say, they are capable of being investigated from any number of standpoints. And a stirrup, piece of copper alloy, the copper dug from the ground, smelted, the object cast, a pattern put onto it, an object which has a particular function, which has been used and reused, which has been repaired, which is sat here in a collection, amongst other objects of similar type, but largely unregarded. Nonetheless, an object capable of immense value in terms of the questions that it will demand of you. Where does it come from? How was it made? What was it made of? Who used it? When was it repaired? Why was it repaired? What value does that tell us it had? All those questions are common to these objects, but the stirrup is the kind of the totemic thing around which this dance will be danced. The other object that I chose is this grim cup and its equally grim saucer. It's actually not a saucer that goes with the cup, strictly speaking. I mean, this is a side plate, and the saucer for the cup is either downstairs on a shelf where I didn't see it, or is lost to us. This is a cup from late 19th century Germany. It's difficult to say what factory it came from. It could be from Rudolstadt, or it could be from another factory closer to Dresden. We don't know, because lots of those porcelain factories use the same marks in the late 19th century, so it's got a mark on it, which, broadly speaking, places it, but beyond that, who knows? But the reason I thought that was interesting is because that grim and poorly painted pattern which is on there, which is actually poorly painted over a kind of fairly coarsely modelled relief, is a direct lift, more or less, from a kind of Renaissance trope, a kind of 15th century Florentine sculptural idea of antiquity, which was brought into play in a kind of playful way, using images of little naked boys running around doing stuff to one another, riding on carts, playing musical instruments, banging cymbals, treading grapes, sometimes doing unspeakable things to one another. There's a sketchbook in the British Museum which I recommend you go and see at some point if you want to be shocked about what people in Padua were thinking about in circa 1480. So this thing has a very kind of direct connection back into the world that I study, and yet it connects back in a very strange way, because it draws on all kinds of other decorative traditions and material traditions. The other interesting thing about it is that it's found its way from late 19th century Thuringia or Saxony, depending on which factory it comes from, to Wyoming. And the fact of things ending up in one place, having started their journey somewhere else, is a part of their fundamental interest. So this evidently has a biography attached to it. Begins somewhere, ends somewhere. It hasn't ended yet, because who knows what the use and function of this thing will turn out to be as a museum object. But it is nonetheless something which embodies not only that journey, but a much longer journey in terms of taste, in terms of modes of manufacture, in terms of economy, which porcelain is a particularly interesting material to consider, because economically, industrially, the acquisition of porcelain technology, the desirability of porcelain technology, the protection of porcelain technology is one of the great stories of early industrial Europe. So this thing contains in it a narrative that is economic, that is historical, that is art historical, that is to do with collecting and taste, that is to do with value and cost, to do with transportation, and to do with whatever happened here in Laramie, which required the use of that cup.
Right.
I'm going to leave that to your imagination, and I'm going to ask whichever one of my colleagues wants to go next to talk about whichever object wants to come next. John, do you want to talk about the basket?
Sure.
Okay.
Start. The basket is my choice. I'm a folklorist, and so I have some training in folk material culture, and so I was looking for something folky on the shelves down there, and a woven basket seemed like a good choice. Apparently, we have no information whatsoever about the provenance, the source, the history, the age of this object. But I find woven baskets particularly interesting as teaching objects. I do teach classes on material culture, and the kinds of questions that we can ask of woven things generally, but baskets in particular are especially interesting to me. And I want to maybe just flip the kind of question that we might ask of an object like this, flip on its head a question that Gregory Bateson, that great synthetic thinker of the 20th century, asked of students in a class of his. He famously brought in a shell from a crab and put it on the table and asked his students to bracket as much as possible whatever knowledge they had about crabs, and just to look at the physical thing that was there, just use their senses. And he asked them how they would know that it is something that is organic, that grew rather than was made by human hands. And I'm wondering, the kind of question I might ask in my material culture class as an initial question is, how might we know, on what basis would we say that that thing, if we bracket it out, what we already know about what a basket is supposed to look like, and ask the question, how do we know that that's a human-made thing and not something that grew? That kind of, maybe somewhat philosophical or theoretical question is the kind of thing that in my teaching I find frequently generates good discussion and good thinking from students, and that one of the things that we were admonished about, and because we're in a museum and these are museum objects, is that we were absolutely forbidden to touch them. So the only sensory data we can really have from this is looking at them, maybe smelling them, and for the basket actually, smell might be a bit of data that would be useful. But if we could touch it, would that give us the kind of information that would allow us to say, oh, this is something that a human made and not something that grew in the ground or that fell off an animal? I don't know how interactive you want to be at this point. If I were to ask you that question, does anybody have a thought about how we would know for sure that this is a human-made thing and not an organic growth? Or is it? I guess that's another.
Well, my first thought would be, I see straight lines. So that would suggest to me that it's human, because there's almost no straight lines in nature.
Okay. And if you got really close and looked really closely, that there aren't exactly straight lines in it. But which raises another question, is how close do we have to look at something? How much intensity of our observation is sufficient or appropriate? But I certainly agree that in general and from a distance, yeah, it looks uniform in a way that we associate with human-made things and that.
Because the form looks like what we call a basket.
Okay, yeah, which is what you'd have to bracket out for this thought exercise to work, right? Because we know what especially, and I don't know, I mean, maybe Andrea has a thought on this, the origin. It's Native American, I assume, whether it's Southwest, the motifs look maybe Northwest coast, possibly, I don't know. I'm not enough of an expert on the patterns and design of Native American basketry, but so we have that kind of information that, of course, we want to bring to bear on objects, but try to step as far away as we can from what we already culturally know and bring to bear just something about and that's in my teaching. That's one of the hardest things I find to get students to do, is to really just think about what's there in front of them first, at least.
I think this is key to using any object in any kind of teaching, is that the question is not what do you know, but what can you see?
Yeah.
And what can you see is the question to which you return again and again and again, because a student will endlessly, or students will endlessly tell you something that they already know. They'll tell you something which they brought to the class, which is good, because we want students to bring things to our classes. We don't want them to be a complete tabula rasa. On the other hand, what we don't want them to do with the object is bundle it around with presuppositions, which stop it being the thing it is on the table and start it being something else, a bearer of other kinds of meaning. So we take that away, and the question that takes that away is, what can you see? And if somebody says something you can't actually see, then the question that you go to is, what can you see that makes you say that? and bring them back and back to the object. Because
And what else corresponds to that or contradicts that? Or, I mean, once you get going, the questions are infinite.
Yeah. Erin, do you want to?
Sure, yeah, this issue of bearing other meanings speaks very, very directly to the object that I was drawn to, which is actually not the object I was most drawn to. The object I was most drawn to was a similar statue that aligned much more closely with the sort of expectations of a late 19th or 20th century racist memorabilia, black memorabilia of a watermelon eater with rinds on the bottom and black and white stripes. And so, I asked Nicole, how did we get this piece of racist memorabilia in our collections? And she says, no, this is a Hopi Kachina statue. And I can't let go of the associations that I bring to an object like this, a racialized caricature, in this case, Hopi produced, but still so close to those other associations. I couldn't resist learning a little bit more about it this afternoon, and more about the association, this virulent racist association of African Americans with watermelons. And in relationships to things that grow, this is another reason I'm interested in this object. It represents a thing that grows that is just a watermelon, and yet, in the United States, watermelon imagery is difficult to look at.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to that, because the question of how that particular piece of imagery relates to the whole object relates to its manufacture and its source, and the material of which it's made, because that is of interest in this instance.
Yeah, and one thing that I've learned is that the clowns have these horizontal stripes and these Kachina statues, or dolls. And watermelons, too, are striped, so that could be the connection.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Janice, do you want to talk about that thing?
I have the advantage of being really ignorant of what I picked out. So I didn't have to fight previous knowledge. It's this rectangle, and it was brightly colored, cartoony, and so it took a moment. It's that wonderful moment, and I'm thinking now of a student coming into the museum and being asked to look at something. What is it? And again, it was partly the color and the design. Well, then quickly you can see that it's a bank, and it's a clever little mechanical bank. But my field is literature, and so I know very little of when these were made. And then, of course, Jonah and the whale, this begins to familiarize me a little bit. But still standing there, I wasn't reading it very well. And I guess from my discipline, I think of us reading these, in a very open way of just trying to understand it and interpret it and where it came from and so on. So I think it might have been Erin, but we said the little blonde person is throwing a nun into the whale.
I was sure it was a nun.
I was too. And so this is such a genuine bafflement that I'm really proud of it. I wasn't doing very well. So looking at it and then looking, you can almost feel like you do see a little face there beneath the wimple. And somebody within the group said, well, no, that's Jonah. I said, right. Because I know Jonah was in the whale, but then I'd forgotten that part about the story of him volunteering to get out of the boat and therefore save those people and therefore do something to mitigate his sin before by not really following God. So full of narrative. And now I can see it, and I think because we weren't allowed to touch it, I don't know exactly how you flip the coin into the whale. But then it provokes so many questions about when was it produced, what kinds of saving banks were being produced alongside it, their cleverness, their wit, what age are they aimed for, were they expensive, is it very much an American thing, these clever little mechanical bank, and then going beyond beyond that to thinking, what is the biblical message about saving, and saving your money and saving your soul, and when again is exactly that a really important narrative in American Protestant thinking, perhaps? Anyway, it intrigues me, it teases me, and I would like to know more about it, and I'd be eager to hear some enlightenment from others as we get into this.
Okay. Thank you. Nick.
Great. So I should say, to begin with, I picked an object that isn't part of the collection, as Nicole reminded me. But it was there in the collection. So this is what happened. We were led downstairs by Nicole to select some objects. We're walking through these different rooms. And I, as a geographer, am always thinking about, these places, kind of space and place, are the concepts that I work with so frequently. And so I found it actually impossible to bracket any object. To go back to this theme of bracketing, it was really, I needed to think about the objects kind of and how they were relating to each other. And so what was really curious to me was that there was this bottom shelf that was full of what looked like junk. So here's the theme of value again. And the junk was, for example, an old binder that was kind of rough around the edges, a folder for the College of Ag, some like packing material, probably for more valuable objects, right? And all this was sitting on a shelf together. And there it is in the collection. Now, of course, yes, it's not tagged and all the rest of it, but something about the way that these objects had been consigned, for example, to a different shelf, and that they were able to kind of create a corpus, in a sense, right? They had this presence there in the space as kind of the junk shelf. And I realize now, after talking with Nicole about it, that actually they ended up there very much accidentally. But there's a kind of ambivalence, actually, in the Mogadishu from the Air calendar that I selected, right? An ambivalence about it because, on the one hand, yes, it's on the junk shelf. And yet, here it is. It has resisted shredding for all these years. It's been around for 30 years now. And so the kinds of questions that I'm interested in, that I think this coughs up, are questions about certainly the conditions for making the object and kind of the conditions of existence for the object itself, but also the conditions for its appearance in this space, right? And so I can talk really briefly about each of those. So on the first, the conditions of existence for the object, I mean, it's interesting that here it is in English, talking about Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, a capital that got its name from Italian colonial geographers, okay, as it happens. And then the calendar kind of has these traces of British and Italian colonialism. It's also published in the 1980s, which is kind of a weird time in Somalia, right? Because in the 1970s, it's a place that's of strategic importance for the USSR during the Cold War. In the 1980s, as the Cold War is waning, we have Somalia kind of weakening governmentally. And here this kind of, it's curious precisely because Mogadishu right now is a place we mostly know through images of war, right? Ever since really the late 1980s. And so this is in this weird moment that this thing is published, where we're not yet maybe overcoding our sense of what this place is through images of war. And so how I would teach this then, I think, would be very much through juxtaposition, right? Like, how weird is this object in relation to, for example, other representations, hopefully representations that have a kind of materiality to them, right? But I'd be thinking about this maybe representation of place as related to another. But again, it's an object. It's not just a text. And so the question of how it came to be in this space is important. And, I think about our whole exercise this morning and about the maintenance of collections. And I think about it because I'm fascinated by it. And I'm not an archivist in any official capacity. And yet I think all the time about how my books are organized, right? I save pieces of scrap between the pages, right? When I come back from a trip, I kind of go through all the stuff I've collected and I stick them as bookmarks. And so I'm always archiving. And I'm thinking about how we are all, in a sense, exercising a certain amount of power when we're selecting these objects. So this is some of the other questions that come up for me, right? When I look at an object like this, again, it's resisted shredding for all these years, despite how mundane it is, and despite the fact that it really doesn't carry the kind of value that maybe some of the other objects in the collection do. There it is. And so, I think about the power that we all exercise as we maintain the presence of these kind of weird objects that are, in a sense, outside the collection, but also in. And because of that outside, inside position, defining, in a sense, the limits of the collection, kind of, what's in and what's out. And I think about the work that we're all doing, actually, and the power we exercise when we carry, in a sense, these objects from from private to public space, right? And we kind of present them to all of us, and I don't know. So these are the questions that come from me again: the conditions for making the object and the conditions for its appearance in this space.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. The question of narrative comes up with this money box. You call it a money box, you call it a bank. Same difference. I think there's one or two people in the audience who think of it as a money box, perhaps. The money box and the strange watermelon bearing figure. The storytelling that goes on with both of these is different from the storytelling that goes on with either the basket or the teacup or the stirrup or the calendar, actually. Although the calendar we'll come to that separately. And I wonder about this question of narrative content and how you think you might approach that from the material object, and whether the materiality of the object is of consequence when you're considering the kind of narrative it embodies.
Well, my first instinct would be to say these are two objects that are not really oriented toward use in the way that the others are. The bank, there's some use to it, but it's clearly telling a playful story at the same time. But then when I did do a little bit of research about these Kachina dolls today, they also have a use. They're given to young Hopi girls to help teach them the things they're going to need to know to be part of the culture. So depends what you mean by use, I suppose.
Okay.
But yeah. The use is specifically cultural and narrative, but it is still a use. And
are there particular narratives associated with particular types of
Yes,
Kachina doll?
that was my understanding. Again, it's my first day researching these dolls.
So, sorry, I'm going to pursue that for a moment. Is that okay, Janice?
Please.
So if you were presented with an object like this and able to use it in a teaching context, how would you approach digging out
To me, I'm very interested in obviously the use of the watermelon, and when a decorative object is something more than that. Is it, I have some qualms, I'll be honest, about even putting this object on the table in terms of the resonances it might bring up for particular people. So yeah, that would be my sort of point of entry, would be something that grows, represented in certain ways, linked up with stories that are told and circulated about race, and the larger meanings there.
Okay. What about the way this is presented? I mean, if we are thinking about that water, how is it presented? And this is an open question. How is it presented? How do we see that watermelon? Okay.
It shows the figure holding it is reasonably strong.
Yeah. It's quite hard to carry a watermelon like that. How's the figure standing?
Precariously.
Precariously. So,
and yet very stable.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a squat.
Sorry, go. Sorry?
Maybe in mid-dance.
Yeah.
Do you know that it's definitely a watermelon?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking of like the aspects would be like ball beans.
Okay. Well, the question there would be, what do you see?
Quite a few of them were holding watermelons, and then at least one was holding a squash. But definitively, yes, watermelon. And this one is very obviously watermelon because of the stripes, but some of them, are sliced open and you're seeing the red.
So just to ask, pursue the question, narrative.
Yeah.
Is there a danger of incorporating a narrative into this?
Well, that's one of my questions.
Yeah.
Am I bringing that to this, or did this bring that to it? You know, I learned today that this Association of African Americans with Watermelons is post-Civil War, which you might not necessarily. I certainly wasn't fully aware of that. But these images, these statues, dolls seem to have been largely produced also after the 1850s.
Okay.
So even if they have a different sort of origin and there is a tribal connection to the watermelon that is different, that doesn't necessarily mean that those resonances aren't taken on even by the Native American artist.
Okay. So if we step back from that for a moment and pursue your point about the possibility that this might be a dance step, what is it about it that tells you that?
There are several things. The clown figures are often storytellers by choosing the opposite, much like our stand-up comedians will take a satirical bend on something. Anytime you see squash in particular, fruit, these areas, very resource-heavy products, so it would be a celebration that comes out.
And what about the stance of the figure? Just purely the thing?
Yeah, I'm actually wondering how it was produced by the people representing, because there are some very strange facial features there, so I didn't get a very good look up close though.
I mean, dance is a particular kind of social construct, a way of moving which is both social and performative, a way of moving which requires expertise. There is an expertise embodied in this, which is about balance and about physical capacity.
The object itself, I mean, to get the thing to stand up.
Yeah. I think it's on a pedestal. Yeah.
It is. It's got a little circle, but it's still a clever thing. I mean, carving a thing like that is Suzanne.
From the South and from a farm environment in the South, watermelons are things you share.
Yeah.
They're big and sweet and juicy. It's a celebration with friends. Of course he's dancing. So to read all of this racist imagery, oh my God, it's a lovely thing he's going to share with his friends, and he's skipping to go have lunch with buddies.
It's not the watermelon's fault that it has these associations. At least I wouldn't say so. But I do think the watermelon actually does bear, I'll take that back, I think the watermelon does bear some blame. It's easy to share, that means it's consumed in public. It's consumed messily. It's large. Going back to the resource comment that Kenny made, it doesn't take a lot of effort to get a lot of result, so sort of associations with laziness are there for the picking as well. You get messy when you eat it, so you're a little bit of a clown or a less respected person.
Yeah.
And one of the things that questions that raises for me is whether or not this really was made for people within the Hopi community that made it, or whether it was made as a souvenir for sale to people.
Sure.
Which is a very good question, because the intended audience is a very good kind of arbiter of what the meaning of the thing is intended to be. And so I think that's a very pertinent question. But the thing about celebration, about sharing, is a reading of this which works with one idea of who this dancer is. It's not a unique way of reading the object. And the question of what you see depends on your viewpoint to some extent. You can't unsee the watermelon.
I can't unsee the watermelon.
You can't unsee the sharing of the watermelon. And those two aspects of this thing, neither of which is explicit in this, tend us to think about it in different ways. The dance thing is the thing which gets me, that this is a specialist, someone who knows what they're doing, and it embodies a kind of special role. And if it is the person who's going to share the thing, then they have that job of giving thanks or bringing it to the table or doing whatever it is that this dance does. So there are a number of ways of approaching this thing, whether you think about it as a dance object, a Thanksgiving and a celebration object, or whether you think about it as an object which embodies problematic ideas that we have inherited and developed over the last century and a half. but it becomes very eloquent narratively in a number of ways. The thing about Jonah is an interesting one as well, because there's a story in which audience and origin might be at odds. I mean, here's a story of an Old Testament prophet, which comes from the sacred texts of more than one religion. A story which itself has been the subject of appropriation, and which is here appropriated again for a different purpose. Right. So if you were thinking about this as a narrative object, what kind of questions would you ask of your students?
Isa began our discussion this morning partly saying, among the things we're trying to think about here are questions about what questions the humanities ask. And so if I'm thinking about that group of students, I think one of the most difficult questions we ask in the humanities is, it's almost to me the kind of thing you asked, John. It's such a hard one. The limits of interpretability, the limits of misreading. If it's tempting to say, well, it is a nun being tossed into the whale. Look, I can see it's a nun. When is that wrong? Because it really doesn't relate to the original story. And I'm just raising it as a question. I think it's a tough question with students because you don't want to go to, we always bring up, well, denial of the Holocaust is wrong. You can't go there. And yet there's so many ways you can go quite far in terms of interpretability, point of view, misreading. You can't unsee what you see. So those kinds of questions I think I would want to get at. Altogether different, maybe on a different tenor, is when we think about what's the purpose of Jonah and the whale story, it is, of course, different generation to generation, age level to age level. So I'm just thinking, I had a little conversation with friends today about it, and one very church-going person said, well, it's about disobedience. And you think, well, that's appropriate perhaps to children. Jonah was disobedient, and then he was obedient, and so to me, again, I think that goes to interpretability. Who's the listener? Who's the recipient? And it changes with time.
So to a child in Sunday school in Laramie, the take-home is, I'm glad I live so far from the ocean. Right. Well, you should be glad you live so far from the ocean, right.
Those are questions I would raise. What would you all, if you were trying to think about it, what questions does it raise for you?
One question that I think we ask is how do we assign value to certain objects and not others? So, like the calendar, is that still going to be in the junk pile, or is how are we going to do that?
Yeah. Here it is. I don't know how long it'll be here. Limited time only.
Right. No, it has some prestige at this very moment.
It does, and that's not for nothing, because everything in a museum has prestige because it's in the museum to some extent. An art gallery is a different thing, and one of the interesting things about this place in particular is that there is, as you know, an ongoing series of temporary exhibitions of contemporary art, and there is a permanent collection of material of which these things are representative, which is here and is available, which is here and is part of the resource of the university. So there are two ways of thinking about this museum in terms of its collection. But value, that thing, and I didn't know this before this morning, so please don't think I have any expertise in this, but that thing was made by the Shepherd Hardware Company of Buffalo, New York in 1890. It was patented in 1890. But it was also made in Taiwan in the 1960s. Now, I haven't turned this thing over to find out whether there's any way of telling that. Right. I would say that as a polychrome object, a painted sculpture is my thing. If it was made in 1890, it's been repainted, not very well. If it was made in Taiwan in the 1960s, maybe it hasn't been repainted, who knows? But the same object performing the same function, made from the same molds, reproduced 70 years apart, will have vastly different value, notwithstanding their identical nature. And that goes to the question of originality. and the question of antiquity, and the question of preservation, whether something becomes more valuable because it's been preserved longer. And so there's a story there about the preservation of this object, which perhaps goes to the question of the preservation of the story. How are stories kept? Do they become less valuable as interpolations are made and as things are chopped off and scribal additions are removed, and as things change, do they become less valuable or more valuable?
I find your research fascinating. What did it take for a group of producers in Taiwan to recreate this and sell it? What marketplace dynamic is going on there? What copyrights? Altogether different. As I stare at it, I might want to ask a student, why is the person in the boat blonde?
Because the painter painted them blonde.
Yes, okay.
No, that's a terrible, sorry, that was such a terrible answer. I do apologise. I'll go. Don't worry.
We could go to your field and say, why is the Virgin Mary blonde and why is Jesus blonde? And
I think then we turn to Erin and we think about why we think about certain people in certain ways and what our presuppositions and stereotypes are, who we want people to be as much as who they are. And clearly the idea that if that is a Taiwanese object of the 1960s, that a blonde person in Taiwan is an exotic thing.
so would it be, I would think, in the Middle East, in...
And so would it have been, indeed. Yeah, in Nineveh.
In Nineveh,
or somewhere off the coast of the sort of Levantine coast of the Mediterranean. Yes, it would be.
Yeah.
Some cultural borrowings are not immediately disturbing, but more kind of just fascinating and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But if I've understood what Erin's anxiety about the doll is, it's the association of the watermelon with a certain kind of denigratory portrayal of African American culture that may have crossed over into another culture by a kind of, we used to call it hybridity, but why not use the dirtier name, miscegenation, a sort of cultural miscegenation.
I also wonder if it went the other way, too. That's one of the questions that I have. Could this Hopi tradition of representing clowns in this fashion have influenced the development of that stereotype?
And so cultural borrowing sometimes disturbs us fairly immediately because we suspect there's some bad or denigratory, maybe unconsciously denigratory aspect like the representation. And I would bid to say that one of the things about the basket is that it seems innocent of that. We're focused more on form, but then we're probably fairly confident that it's the product of one culture without much borrowing from another. And I think it's often when there is this hybridity or miscegenation of cultures that we start getting disturbed because the resonances of one culture that we're not very happy about, or the representation of that culture that we're not very happy about, are now being placed in a different context and maybe disturbing it as well, in ways that have similar associations and may be unconscious to the representer, but are there because, let's say, sales. They want to sell something that looks happy, that looks charming, but maybe actually diminishing perfidiously the value of that culture at a more general level.
Yeah, and I think that partly this is where that question, I think, Kenny, this was your question, or perhaps it was Susan's, I can't quite remember, of, who were these made for, and at what stages, and do the representations of these clown figures with watermelons change in relationship to that market?
One thing that interests me is in the conversation is how quickly we move from the objects to things outside the object to understand them with. Right. So when we ask about narrative in relation, we think about the biblical narrative, Jonah, of course, but we leave behind what might be considered narrative dimensions of the materiality of the objects themselves, the most obvious of which being, literally the process of their making. How might we, and it's another thing that you can engage students with is, how might we think about an object as the product of narrative manufacture or manufacture of being narrative?
And that's a question of looking, because unless you know how something is carved, then you have to look at it in order to discern tool marks. And you have to think about the way up it was held when it was being carved. How was it fixed? Is there a mark on the bottom that shows it was held between 2 points? All those questions, which bring you back to the thing, will help you refocus every time you ask them. The innocence of the basket is an interesting thing. The idea that this is somehow free of those kinds of appropriating aspects, which even with the Mogadishu thing, this is a very Western object dealing with a representation of a very non-Western place. But is the basket innocent, or does its presence in a museum rob it of some of that innocence?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can, if we're thinking about the biographies of objects, and that they have stories. One of the big stories that applies to maybe all of these, or several of them, is that they are a moment in a colonial project, right? I mean, these have been brought into a museum, an environment where we can sit in this room and think about them. And however remotely in some cases, they're acts of appropriation that are part of their story. So there are ethical questions to be raised through objects about merely collection, archiving, the museum itself as part of their story.
And yet these are objects about which we've all discovered the same thing. That is to say, we don't know much about that, we don't know much about that, or that, or that. We know more about the Mogadishu thing because it's full of writing. Hurrah for writing. But these are things which are in the museum as part of larger collections. There are 3 mechanical backs together on the shelf. There is a whole bunch of this 19th century German porcelain. There's a group of stirrups. There is a whole cabinet full of these Hopi
multiple cabinets
things, and there are a load of baskets. So they exist in relation to other objects here, but they don't exist in relation to a large body of information. And that kind of nakedness of the object, I think, is something which, when you bring things into a teaching context, is sometimes very useful. Sometimes you deny the knowledge of the object, so you just don't give the information. You ask the student to look. Sometimes if you don't have the knowledge, then actually the student is feeding our understanding of the object as they are being taught and as they are learning. And that's a useful alternative relationship to simply presenting the student with the object and expecting them to learn, is that we will learn actually as this process goes on. Nick, you're about to say something and I just kept talking.
No, it's great. I like this conversation about narrative, and I really like where John took it, actually. Returning us to thinking about the biography of things. Anthropologists called it for a while the social life of things, right? And I guess even beyond the production, the kind of the maintenance of the thing, not yet waste, is something that makes me curious about that particular object that I chose. But really about, all of these are potentially waste. There actually would be trash, right?
Yeah.
We could, but we're not. And so part of their value is communicated by just their very presence in a collection where we're told not to touch. In fact, we were given some rules, right? No touching and pencils only.
No water.
And no
Sorry?
water.
No water.
And no water. I know you're like, right. And so that's part of the social life of these things as well.
That specialness is underlined by those kinds of rules. And those kinds of rules which go to the preservation of the object are things which further privilege the object. That by not touching them, they will last longer. There is an object here which we haven't spoken about.
Exactly.
Which is this photograph by Richard Throssell, which is from the American Archive next door, and which is a remarkable thing. It gives itself up in one way and then it becomes something else the closer you look. brightly coloured photograph, but hand coloured. So its colours belie its age. It records some kind of event, but it's hard to know what kind of an event it is just by looking. And so we rely on information for this. But as a photograph, as a thing, rather than as a bearer of a particular kind of content, it is fascinating. This is an object which has been reproductively produced, but which has been transformed by hand in a unique way. So it embodies aspects of both serial and individual production in order to make it something more than a photograph, something more than a document, something which becomes then kind of decorative, I suppose. So that's, I don't know what I'm saying about that. Anyone want to chip in, please?
Well, I'd be happy to, actually. I mean, I think, again, going to the kind of the conditions of existence for the object, I mean, all of these bear marks of kind of, I don't know, I mean, prosthetics, tools that kind of produced them. Yeah. I mean, the camera is there in the object, and we have one perspective going on in that particular photograph that's been painted, but then there's another perspective going on in this other photograph that we have, right, from above, I mean, from the air. And so, we talked about the kind of traces of colonialism and the narrative of colonialism running through all these objects. Like, how much more colonial could it be? We're seen from afar, seeing like the state, this is what's going on in that. And so I think that all of these objects sort of bear witness to other tools, for example, but other objects as well. And so it's really hard to kind of approach them innocently.
In which case, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, the process of painting, I mean, the objectification that's going on in the image, I mean, it's already highly objectivizing of Native people. I mean, you don't see any of their faces, for one thing, right? It's from behind. And then to enhance the image with paint is an added layer of object making, objectifying. So even in the what seem like the neutral processes of making apparently a more desirable or prettier picture, there are deeper narratives of the objectification of Native peoples.
When I first looked at When I first looked at that photograph, that was an example of one where I was so fascinated by how it had been hand-colored that I didn't actually pay a lot of attention to the narrative there. I was particularly interested in the little bits of blue in the snow. So somebody had really studied color. But thinking about it now, and I don't really even remember very well what the image was of. I'm thinking about a lot of really interesting scholarship on particularly, photographic representations of Native Americans and the ways that contributes to the cultural narrative of the vanishing Indian, sort of always already gone, despite like actual living presence, the association of photographs with death, and the way that coloring adds life back in a very sort of aerial kind of way.
And colouring strangely, in a way, denudes things of life as well. It makes them more artificial. So whilst making that more realistic, because we see in colour, at the same time it stops it, which is what you were saying. Same with the strange little cup. I have to talk about the cup because no one else will, because it is ghastly. But okay, before we get to the cup,
real quick back to this.
Yeah, please.
We have a photo of a ranch. What's the dude ranch?
It's the Square G.
The Square G in Jackson, long thing that has been hand-colored from a photo. And I've always thought it was, in fact, maybe that's part of the story. It was, say, the daughter of someone who did it. And so I think if we knew more, we could say many different things about who colored it. It could be a family member. It could be someone, and it's almost to me almost like a single hairbrush. It is so fine. So I just wouldn't know exactly where to go with the objectification necessarily, unless I knew more.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And I don't know. Do we know whether Throssell coloured his own photographs? Anybody? Richard Throssell. Did he colour his own photographs? Yep.
Some he did, some he didn't. Some he had
Thank you very much for that ambivalent answer. Nicely judged, and we're very grateful. But if he did indeed, then he's doing something to his own. If someone else has done it, then it's taking something and...
Yeah, and even then, he may be doing it for commercial reasons, and I do
I'm sure
understand
for
that.
commercial reasons,
I would want to know more.
Yeah. The question of whether the thing becomes more real as a result of the colours.
Yeah.
So the modelling on that cup is probably better than the painting. If you take away the colour, you can't read it as easily, but if you take away the colour, you have a better cup. I don't know, but the painting does something to the painting does something to the modelling which transforms it and makes it in a way more cartoony, more sort of strange, and yet is precisely the thing which brings it into focus.
I did want to ask you about the cup. I wanted to ask you about the cultural borrowings involved.
Yeah.
Which you mentioned at the beginning. You were suggesting that the Florinian artists were actually part of a long tradition based in or beginning in Italy.
Well, those...
But where you suggest, you had a value term, I can't remember it was something like drear, but it was almost more scary than that.
Grim.
And I wonder, was it in relation to so much better earlier Italian work that you were calling it grim, or was it culturally grim in some way because of its presuppositions about the ways that children behave?
No, I don't think it's grim from that point of view.
What was the value?
The grimness. The grimness is that it's the end of a line of degradation to some degree. I think so. I mean, this kinds of relief porcelain, for instance, were made at Capodimonte, also in the 18th and 19th century, and better. And if you look at a little Renaissance bronze plaquette of Putty doing exactly this kind of thing, riding on carts and sporting with one another, then again, they're often done better. So there's a qualitative thing there, and I was being flippant to some extent. But the grimness is that this represents the end of a line of degradation, and the colour doesn't help much. I'm a horrible person. I'm going to hell. I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
It's like the bank is the Jonah story.
Yeah.
So in a savings bank, of course, for this era, it means discipline, right? So it's about obedience. But you're familiar, there's actually a sarcophagus at the Ashmolean, isn't there? A late antique sarcophagus, not uncommon in late antiquity for it to have a Jonah image on it. And then it is not actually all about obedience. It is about coming to life again when you thought things were dead.
Exactly.
Sure.
And say also in a very subtle way about the fear of being called by God and being called by belief, because Jonah is afraid to be a prophet because he believes he will be persecuted, as people who say things opposed to what he often are. And so that is actually what prevents him from taking that step of believing that he will actually have a life and he will be protected by God, or that there's a larger plan available.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to say that when you say, well, it's grim, it is, but I'm going to say it's grim, but it is fine and new for that era.
Absolutely.
The image as it is produced in any historical period or culture that it gets moved to, as much as like a late antique person, I just think, oh my goodness, that is horrendous that now gets put in a vaguely, in a childish object when it before has such power as a story in the Tanakh. But it isn't.
And you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's possible for me to look at this very snobbishly, as I have done, because of that, because my familiarity with this kind of imagery starts further back.
Sarcophagus is better too.
But the cup is a fancy cup.
Yeah.
It was an expensive fancy cup, part of an expensive fancy set that was brought out on special occasions, and therefore it embodies another kind of value which is nothing to do with whether or not this is a degraded image from the 15th century or from antiquity. It's to do with its presence there in the late 19th century as a piece of fine porcelain which is decorated, whether in your taste or not, with some care. You're absolutely right about the Jonah object and the way in which that narrative, A, can be read in any number of ways, and B, in which, because it is a symbolic narrative, the kind of manifestation of those symbols is less important in a way than the fact of those symbols. So I think it is a very narratively eloquent thing. I'm sorry, I was going on.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a couple of points. One is several of the things, particularly the dancer and the Jonah and the photograph and even the cup, when we start to interpret, we go to previous knowledge and information. But when we look at the stirrup and the basket, it may just be our own ignorance, but we don't have the ability to go backwards from it in some sense. I mean, we know what a stirrup looks like, and as a Westerner, I can't look at the stirrup without thinking in terms of comparison and how a stirrup is made in the West out of wood and hide versus this thing which is made out of copper. I look at the size and I think this isn't sort of the design for a broad variety of people. This is designed for a child or maybe a woman's foot or a small woman. It has design on it, which says to me, maybe it's not. I mean, I ask the question, is this a showpiece as opposed to a daily use piece?
And there's the question, because the only way you would know about that is by looking at it, is by examining it, by looking closely. And then you would see that there's a piece that's been broken off and then repaired. So it's a piece, it is a thing that has been used to the point of breakage and valued to the point of being worth repairing. So those things which are accessible just by looking with no prior knowledge are things which will tell you something about the longer history of this object biography, if you like. So the question of materially raised here, this is a cast copper thing, or brass perhaps, or bronze perhaps, but I think probably just copper. The material of that and the question of its origin, the material of the basket actually is something which I've really thought about. We thought about what's been done with the material, but where do you get it from? Different colours, different thicknesses of whatever it is that it's made of. How is it made pliant enough and not brittle enough to make that thing? Those material questions are questions which the object itself will begin to A, ask, and B, give up the answers to.
With the stirrup, there's also questions about whether that object, that form, is actually a kind of metal version of prior objects that are, I mean, there's to me like there's sort of skeuomorphic elements to it, that those things that are in an object that don't have functionality, but they harken back to a previous form of the same thing. It could well be that stirrups of that form were made from wood and leather at one time, and this is whether it was actually a functioning used stirrup or not, or a metal version of a real stirrup.
It makes you wonder whether those round bosses were once upon a time the only metal.
The only metal on it,
That's
right, exactly, yeah.
I don't know. Stirrups, anyone? Yeah. Please.
I'd like you to address some ethical questions about the interpretations that you're inclined to give to ordinary things, and what do you feel an obligation to say what you think is probably accurate in the permanent record associated with these things, when it's not a work of art, it's an object like a stirrups or a piece of clothing or something that ends up in a museum. How much interpretation is a collection manager or curator expected or not expected?
That's a very good question.
Can I just ask you to, I'm so interested in that question, and I'll let you answer it, but can I just ask you to follow up a little bit more on, are you asking about the right of the object not to be interpreted? Is that the ethics that you have in mind, or the ethics of, users of the collection?
Well, I'm thinking of the here and now.
Yeah.
The fact that whatever you say is related to this time, this place, that object, and any interpretation that you might give to it is subjective. So are you obligated to not say anything?
No. But I think it's important to keep interpretation and objective fact, to keep some distance between them. And so if you look around this gallery, there is an informative text at the opening of the show, which tells you something about the artist, tells you something about the work. As you go around the show, the information which you're given is to do with title and date and medium and dimension, such that you know how big the thing is, you know what it's made of, and you know when it was made, and you know what it's called. But beyond that, the interpretation at that point is between you and the object. So there is a generosity in displaying things like this, which means that you're not constantly being given either a curatorial interpretation or the interpretation of the artist. That job is done kind of in one location. And that means that you are able, as a viewer, to bring to the object whatever it is that you want to, and to allow the object to bring itself to you, if not quite naked, then at least without too much extraneous noise. So that's one thing, is you separate interpretation from the facts of the object. If you're using objects like this in a teaching context, that is to say not display, but you're bringing them in front of a class of students, or you're giving them to someone to really look at for the first time, then I think that you are obligated to leave interpretation aside, at least at first, and you're obligated to look and see what you see. Identify what you can see, talk about what you can see, and then think about what that means. I don't know whether there is an ethical issue in that beyond the ethical responsibility of a gallery to a living artist whose work is being interpreted in one way or another. But in terms of these objects, I don't think there is one. I think that your position as a teacher is to allow the student to look first, deal with the facts of the thing in front of them, what they can see, and then let them ask questions which will lead to interpretation, I suppose. Sorry, Rob.
I'm a little bit confused by the conception of seeing the object. So we look at these objects in particular, right? So pick what you want, right? Basket, cup, stirrup, doll, right? But to even see them as something as simple as a cup or a basket is already embedded in a whole bunch of presuppositions about human cultural activity, right? Ones with which we're familiar in some sense, right? And if that's the case, then, I mean, isn't even to see them as a cup or a basket itself already an act of interpretation when we look at the object, such that there is no such thing as looking at the object naked or bare, right? And if that's the case, then that maybe raises a whole bunch of other questions about, I'm trying to articulate this, right? The way we've been talking about some of these things is though there's some distinction between the object and the interpretation. I wondered if any of you had any.
I would like to speak to that because I actually have thought about this question a lot since the last time you were here, where we just sort of talked about what do we do with these objects, and let's just talk about what we're seeing before we move to that step of interpretation. And that, and those of you who teach literature in the audience, is something that we do when we teach literature all the time. And it's so hard, especially for beginning students, to look even at a paragraph and not go to, well, what the author means here is X, Y, and Z, and just what can you notice about the words on the page. So I think it is always going to be an artificial exercise, but I think it's a very valuable one in literary study, and actually thinking about the literary text in that more material object sense helps me communicate that better to my students than I was able to before we had that conversation.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, your question goes to this point about the way in which objects present themselves differently to people involved in different kinds of disciplinary inquiry. The question of the practical criticism of a piece of text, where you really want to encourage the student to go back to the words on the page before they start to overlay what they already know, is a not dissimilar question to the philosophical question of what is it we look at, and at what point does interpretation impose itself? Does it impose itself by virtue of the cupness? Because the cupness will not be of interest to everybody who looks at the object. For some people, what will be interesting will be the porcelain-ness of the object. For some people, will be the sculptural-ness of the object. For some people, will be the paintedness of the object. And the first thing that caught my eye about this was not the cupness, but the sculptural-ness of it, because it recalled a piece of sculpture that I know. And so my own kind of overlay of interpretation was the cutness of it was a secondary issue. And so we will all bring those disciplinary interpretive priorities to the object.
Can I just follow up?
Yeah, please.
So, I mean, that seems to suggest to me that there is no object outside of the interpretation.
I can't argue that with a philosopher. I genuinely cannot argue that with a philosopher.
Outside of interpretation.
Or outside of some one interpretation of another.
Yeah.
Okay, well, in that case, I would say that there is a thing on the table. There is a thing on the table. That, unless we go to the question of whether anything actually exists at all. And please let's not go there. There is a thing on the table. And the question of what the thing is, Sue, sorry. I was interrupting you, I think.
No.
Okay.
I'm egging him on.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Can I take this in a slightly different direction?
Yes, you can.
I think we have underestimated the human figure here, the portrayal of the human figure here. Erin introduced it within the context of racial objectification from a different context, looking at the watermelon and the symbolism of the watermelon in particular. And then somebody mentioned it comes from a case, or several cases, of Kachinas. At that point, I mean, looking at the watermelon, you think, okay, we're taking this object, bringing it to us, trying to interpret it by our codes, or at least codes with which we are familiar. I think there's a set of Kachina codes.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at this thing as I travel around the West and visit various gift shops, and I see hundreds of these things. And as a religious studies professor, I go, ooh, a religious object. I should collect this. I have never purchased one because one of the things I've figured out, and reading Tony Hill helped me work this out, is that the paint, the clothing, is all coded. And every one is a different object. I mean, a different set of meanings. And if I was to acquire one, I would have no understanding of what its code is. It would simply be an object. I wouldn't have any understanding of it without doing serious comparative research and so on. And then, of course, there's the question of these are being sold for collecting to outsiders. One of the things you pick up from Tony Hillerman is that this is secret knowledge. And so I even wonder if any of these are actually real sets of colors and patterns, or if they are simply patterns made up for outsiders so that they will collect those and not be exposed to secret knowledge. And so with that, I guess my point is the issue of whose codes are we using? Are we using our codes or their codes? I mean, is this even a doll? I mean, is that even the right term?
Yeah. That's precisely the value of that exercise, though, of, okay, here's an object. I am inevitably bringing things to it. If I step back, what can I learn about the object? And then, for me at least, what can I also then learn about the codes? Yeah.
And everything is coded to some degree or other, whether for religious purposes or not, and decoding what objects embody in that way is part of what we all do when we encounter them, whatever discipline we come from. But we decode them in different ways. For a material scientist, the copperness of that stirrup is a very interesting thing. Where does it come from? How is it smelted? Is it alloyed with anything? If so, what are the alloying agents? Do they come from one location or are they brought to it? Are they accidental or deliberate? All those questions, which are accessible through the material, have nothing to do with this being a stirrup.
Right.
But they might be unpacked further if you knew where the stirrup came from. So, or who the stirrup was made for, or who the stirrup was made by, or the date at which the stirrup was made. So the information which appears not to relate to its materiality, in fact, bears very closely upon its materiality. So these inquiries overlap. And one of the interesting things about what's happening here is that these random objects, which we gathered this morning, without relation to one another, in other words, there was no sense that we were trying to put together a group, we were finding things that were of interest to us, has become a teaching group. And we are considering questions of materiality, we're considering questions of the human figure. Even in the objects that don't really embody the human figure, the stirrup relates to the foot. It's a very physical thing. The basket relates to the hand. You know, it's the only way you can put this thing together. Mogadishu is full of people. Where are they? You know, the human figure is present in all these things, but that's only one way of thinking about them. And that randomness here has resolved itself into one kind of inquiry. But it's only one kind of inquiry.
The secret or the hidden is often what drives us to inquire.
Yeah.
Nick said something about the Mogadishu calendar, or the calendar about Mogadishu earlier, and he said that it was infused with remnants of both Italian and British colonialism. And that was what my ears picked up. I wanted more explication of that, because it might not be something that leapt off the surface, but it might be a deeper meaning that actually revealed more about the object as a cultural production.
Nick, do you want to, because this is a secret to all of this because we're not allowed to open it, but you have looked through it.
Oh, have you?
Well, a little bit.
You touched it.
A little bit. What's inside?
Well, actually, I think people in the audience have opened it up and looked through it more than I have.
Only bad people in the audience.
But a couple of things come up here. First of all, I realize that I'm treating this as a text in many ways and not necessarily as an object, except that I did see it, as I said, consigned to a shelf. In a sense, you know, we think about sorting in collections all the time, right? And the kind of categories that we use to sort. I mean, it was consigned to a shelf among other objects that were all of lesser value, perhaps even almost kind of junk, right? And so the objectness of it is in that, I guess, for me, that it's consigned to this shelf, that it's part of a collection, that this collection of objects starts to kind of cohere into a corpus that we think of, perhaps, I don't know if everyone else would agree, as the junk shelf. Okay, so there's that. But in terms of these histories, I mean, part of it is, you know, thinking about the name. I mean, Somalia coming from the Italian encounter with Somaliland, right? And then that it's Anglophone, the calendar. You know, even at this point, what would it be? 2.5 decades after independence, the calendar is in English. And so there's this kind of gesture to, I mean, power, or the kind of traces of colonial power that are, for me at least, all over it. And yes, that comes from my own disciplinary training and my own formation, which raises for me, I guess, kind of a teaching question, if I may. I mean, if I've treated that adequately. I mean, I'm not a literary scholar, and yet I can appreciate what may be at stake in sort of separating content, meaning, form, these sorts of things, so that students can learn and can scrutinize a literary object carefully. As I think about teaching with an object, I can't help but think about it in relation to everything else. Again, relation is the word for me. In relation to everything else that I put in the syllabus, right? I mean, there's never any innocent interpretation. No. I try to emphasize that with my students, that, you know, I'm leading you, I'm interpolating you, I'm enrolling you. And, you know, I mean, I hope that you enjoy it. It's kind of the idea, right? And so,
But be aware.
But be aware, yeah. You know, deconstruct me like I'm encouraging you to deconstruct the authors we're reading in class. And so, I guess I have trouble imagining that there's ever an encounter with the object that the student is having in this kind of innocent way.
Okay, well, one
so
thing
I'll just raise that.
Okay, I'd like to kind of go to that to some extent, which is to say that this object, this Mogadishu calendar, this is an object which lends itself to further reproduction very easily. That is to say, photographic image and text. We see photographic images and text reproduced for us every day on PowerPoint presentations, one of our principal teaching tools. It's a useful thing for showing lots of people the same thing at the same time. And you could reduce that to a PowerPoint so easily. But the encounter of it in a PowerPoint, which will give you all the information that you need about its content, is not the encounter with that thing, which has survived the 30 years, as you say, where the ring binding is kind of broken, where the edges are frayed, where there are dog ears, where there is roughness because it's been opened and closed. It doesn't tell you something about its scale. That's a big old calendar.
Yeah.
I mean, who has a calendar like that on their wall? Answer: nobody, because our calendars are on our phones. So it's an object of time as well as its scale is a thing of chronology as much as anything else. So there are lots of things which the thing will do very differently from the image of the thing. So as a teaching object, it's very different from a teaching series of image and texts. And I would argue that that's true of all of these, and the uniqueness, that is to say, that Mogadishu calendar, which is damaged and beaten up, is different from a mint version, which a collector might want.
Yeah.
We had a question.
John,
Can you clarify how you're using the word text versus object? I heard Nick refer to saying, like, well, of course I'm going to use text, and Larry mentioned, well, you people who study literary objects, and now...
I would say respond with simplicity bordering on idiocy, which is to say, I would say a text is a thing with writing you can see.
Right, but people are also talking about how we're reading objects, which is...
Right, and we could say everything is a text.
Right, which I'm used to people hearing.
I know. It's our jargon.
Yeah, here I'm making the distinction between a thing and a piece of writing, essentially, which is not a kind of sufficiently complex way of thinking about it in many circles presently.
I think often that question is best answered with, is it useful for what you're trying to find out? So I can think of certain sessions, the city as text, and you have a group of students going in and trying to read the city. If that's useful for all kinds of rich inquiry, great. It's not that it has to be right or wrong, how we define text. It's like how useful for this inquiry.
I guess maybe then my question is, what's an object?
I think that's a reformulation of Rob's question. Do we ever come to something without bringing some level of interpretation to it?
Right. I want to respond also to that. I used to say to students something called the Heuristic Circle, and it was the inevitability of taking a sliver of something and trying to imagine what the whole is, and then correcting the second sliver by what you've added. So it's just this inevitable process of part, whole, as we are doing here with this.
Which in novelistic terms is not unlike publishing something in chapters week by week over the course of a year.
Yeah.
So there's a very Dickensian aspect to this. You read a bit, you read the second bit, and then you realise that the first bit was actually tricking you.
Exactly. It's a dialogue between part and whole. And so you're asking your students in that first paragraph, try just to look at that first paragraph and say,
and
but
that's an example
inevitably
of looking at the text in a material sense, right? And I don't know how far we can go with this in terms of the philosophy of it, but yeah, like literally the exclamation points, the commas, as opposed to, this reminds me of the time that I was walking to my grandmother's house.
Right.
Yeah. Can we go back to the issue that was raised before about the inability to step outside our cultural horizons and all bring categories? It seems to me that pedagogically one of the things that the objects can help us with is to defamiliarize those categories we operate with. So when we have a seemingly random set of objects here, we could ask a question like, if you had to put these in sets, what goes with what, and on what basis do they go together? That's another kind of discussion generator among students. And there are all sorts of ways in which we could rearrange these to go together. Like what? I mean, that's a question. Can I ask that of anybody? What would you put together as things that...
And on the basis of what?
Well, I was thinking about aesthetics, which is something we haven't really talked about.
No, we haven't.
The reaction that the items, the objects produce in us. Now, it seems to me that the Jonah and the whale and the cup are what we might call, certainly what I would call kitsch.
That's one way of reading them.
Whereas I wouldn't regard the Kajina, and I know there are some problems, we've discussed some issues relating that, doesn't quite fit into that pitch bracket of the other two.
But it's not
syrup and the basket, to me, they are the two that I would say have beauty. I don't think I could say of the other objects, they are beautiful. They're interesting, they've got things of beauty. So I don't know if we want to say anything about that or not. But I would perhaps put them into classifications in that way. They're ephemera, perhaps a photograph in the calendar. The kitsch objects and the two beautiful artifacts, the two beautiful pieces, then I'm left with the dog, and I could put that. Perhaps with those others because it's representational.
When the objects were on the cart, finally after being on their various shelves in various rooms, Janice and I noticed that the bank and the kachina have the same, are very similar color schemes.
Yeah.
Never would have crossed my mind unless they were there on the cart together,
So I knew this was going to happen just when we got going. They're going to kick us out of the galleries because we're about ready to be finished. As we're winding up this conversation, I'd like to say a few things. One, there's lots more to talk about. Anyone who wants to keep talking is welcome to join us at Front Street, where we're going to adjourn for a drink, and so please come. More substantively, as we're thinking about decoding things and what's in the museum and the stories that it tells and even its materiality, I would just encourage you to look around where you're sitting. The artist who made all of this work, Hung Lu, is going to be on campus next week, and you could engage her in some of these questions more immediately. So do that. Look, see what you see, and then come and hear what she has to say about what it is that you're looking at. I would like to really thank our panelists and the audience for your contributions. And again, to wholeheartedly thank the staffs of the Art Museum and the American Heritage Center for making this sort of non-traditional conversation possible. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for participating.
Thank you, Isa.
Thank you.